Now, this host property, which can be added to add component, can be useful, as I explained, because we can, for example, also use it somewhere else in our application, on the dashboard item. In the dashboard item template, I have that div with the class dashboard item. And this is a bit redundant. We don't need that extra wrapper around this article. So what we could do is remove it here from our template. And we could now go to the dashboard item component TypeScript file and add host here. And then again, use that setting to add the class property to the host element. So to this app dashboard item element. And set it to a value of dashboard-item, or whichever CSS class you want to add here. And if you do that, you'll see that your application looks broken. Well, it is now broken because, of course, in the dashboard item CSS file, I'm still setting up styles that are scoped to this component, so that only look for matches inside of the component template. So if I'm looking for an element with a CSS class of dashboard item on it, Angular will only look for it in this component's template. And here we have no such element with that class on it anymore. Sure, that class exists on the host element, and you can confirm that it was added by inspecting this on the running page. Here on app dashboard item, you find that class, but it is ignored because of that style scoping, because of that encapsulation. So of course we could disable encapsulation by setting encapsulation to view encapsulation none, as we did it for the control component, or we go for a different approach, which is what I'll do here. Nonetheless, I wanted to highlight that you can add that host property to any component, not just components without view encapsulation. Here, for this specific use case, it just won't work the way you want it to work maybe, but if you were to add any other property, like maybe an ID, then you could absolutely do that through that host property. But here, for this use case, host is not a tool that will help us. Instead, to style the host element of this component, we should go to the dashboard item component CSS file and use another feature about which you learned earlier. In here, you can use the "host" selector and replace all dashboard item class occurrences with that, also here in the media query. And with that, we got back our styles and it looks the way it did before, but now again using this host element styling. Of course, we can now also revisit the other components and see if we can get rid of some unnecessary wrappers here. For example, in server status, there I also have that div with that ID. We could delete that div with that ID, so that I just have this conditional statement in here. And then in server status component CSS, I'll replace all those ID selectors with :host. And by the way, there are certain rules in here which won't have any effect yet, but we'll change this soon. For the moment, I'll just replace my ID selector with :host. And it turns out I only had one in here. Now, here in the new ticket component, we could get rid of that form element and rely on our component host element as a wrapper around these input elements. But the built-in form element is an element I don't want to remove here because it makes sense to have it for semantic and accessibility reasons. Our custom component host element won't tell the browser anything, won't tell screen readers anything, and therefore you typically want to avoid getting rid of semantically important elements. It's different for things like divs, which have no semantic meaning, but forms, buttons, sections, and things like that, you might want to consider keeping those as wrappers instead of replacing them with your component host element as a wrapper. In the ticket component, I don't have any markup yet. We didn't work on that yet, so I'll leave it the way it is. In the tickets component, however, I do want to make a change, because in the tickets component CSS file, I now want to target host here instead of an element with ID tickets, which doesn't exist yet anyways, because that will help us later in this section. So here on all my rules, I'm targeting the host element. In the traffic component, I'll get rid of that div with ID traffic here. And instead, again, target host, just as we did it before. And with that, if I save that and reload, it again looks the way it did before, but now we're taking advantage of the fact that Angular does render that host element, and that allows us to avoid unnecessary wrappers. Now, when it comes to working with that host element of an Angular component, there are two other things you should know about. And the first thing is that when it comes to adding properties to the host element, you can use this host setting on the component decorator object, and that is the preferred way of doing it. But alternatively, you can also add a property to your component class and name it class name, for example, and set the value you wanna bind on your host element, so control in my case, and then decorate this with the host binding decorator, which must be imported from @AngularCore. Now, what host binding will do is it will take a look at this property name, and it will then add it as a property to the host element and set this as a value for that property. Therefore, I can comment out host here and instead use host binding. Now, I technically don't want to use class name here, but class. And I could use it here, but to avoid any confusion with the built-in class keyword, we might want to use a slightly different property name here. And that's why host binding, this decorator, also takes an optional input, an optional argument, which allows you to define the actual property that should be bound as a string. So now the value here will be set as a value for this class property with help of host binding, even though the property name here is different. You only need this argument here though if you have a different property name than you want to bind. With that, if you reload, you got the same look as before, but now with host binding. That being said, using host binding is discouraged though. You should instead use the host property. This feature just exists for backward compatibility reasons because in the past it was a common way of setting those host properties. Nowadays, you should prefer this host property on the component decorator object. There also is a host listener decorator, which you can import and use, which allows you to bind a method to an event to which you want to listen here. Alternatively, you could add event binding here as well. And for example, listen to a click event, and then here define the method of the class that should be executed when that event occurs. So here, for example, we could add an onClick method and simply console log clicked. And if we want to trigger this whenever the host element is clicked, we can either do that by adding this value to our host object here in the component decorator. So I'm using that event binding syntax here, as you can tell. And then also as a string, I define the code that should execute when that click on the host element occurs. So here I'm telling Angular that it should execute the onClick method of this component. And if you do that and you comment out host listener for the moment, If you open your console here on the page, whenever I click into one of my controls, you see clicked gets logged here. So you can also listen to events on the host element by using this syntax, or, as I mentioned, alternatively with host listener. Then you would directly assign the method that should be triggered as a value here, though you then also must pass an argument to host listener and specify the event to which it should listen. So now you would be telling Angular that it should listen to click events on the host element and trigger that method whenever such a click occurs. With that, if I save this and reload, we also see that clicked output in the console as I click on those controls. So that again is an alternative to using this syntax. Now, I personally actually prefer this alternative. I think it looks a bit cleaner than defining this here, but the Angular team recommends this approach, which is why I'm showing it and recommending it to you here in this course. So that's how you could listen to events on your host elements. Of course, we now also have to make sure that this onClick method exists though, otherwise this will fail.